Hello or namaste. Welcome to Atypical Dikkate, a conversation podcast. I'm your host Soumya, and in this podcast, I talk to fellow queer, neurodivergent, and disabled folks. This podcast is not just a repository of stories and experiences, but it is also a journey to build solidarity, queer intimacy, and a community while highlighting neglected issues including reproductive and sexual health and rights. Today, I have Dipika with me. Dipika Lama is a dedicated youth leader, disability rights advocate, and intersectional activist from Madhesh, Nepal. Her work focuses on amplifying the voices of indigenous, Dalit, Madheshi, and Muslim women and girls with disabilities. She serves as the president of the Madhesh Indigenous Disabled Women Association Nepal Midwan, as a board member of the National Federation of Disabled Nepal Madhesh Province, and a focal person of Indigenous Disabled Women Association Nepal Nidwan for Madhesh Province. She is also a youth member of the Asia Pacific Network of Indigenous Women with Disabilities, the focal person for Nepal in the Asia Pacific Young Feminist Forum, and a fellow of the Arrow Advocacy Institute Cohort 2, focusing on advancing SRHR rights. Through her activism, Dipika is committed to fostering inclusive spaces, influencing policy reforms, and ensuring that marginalized communities are recognized, represented, and respected. She engages at the provincial, national, and regional levels to promote intersectional human rights, inclusion, and social justice. Hi, Dipika. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, sister, for that kind introduction and for having me on Atypical Dikkate. I'm very honored to be here and to be part of this important conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Let me just start with saying that congratulating you, first of all. Like, you are doing such an amazing work as a young person, and I'm very proud and inspired by everything you have done so far. And to start us off, we'll start with your personal experience. Can you share what's been like navigating your sexual and reproductive health and rights as a young indigenous person with a disability? What kinds of challenges have shaped your experience?
Thank you so much for that appreciation, and thank you so much for asking my own experience because I think it really matters while talking about myself and our voices. So, while navigating SRHR as a young indigenous women with disability has been incredibly challenging for me. In my own personal experience, firstly in my indigenous community, especially in rural areas of in Nepal, SRSR services are either completely absent or extremely limited. So these are the nearby like gynecological care, no access to contraceptives or safe childbirth support, and no trained professionals, healthcare providers who understand how to communicate accessibly with person with disabilities and also with the social marginalized communities, as indigenous communities have their own native languages, so they really have poor education about it. And so for someone like me or other young women with disabilities who is from marginalized communities or indigenous community face similar situation, even getting basic information about own bodies becomes a huge challenge for us. So when services do exist, they are inaccessible in so many ways, like physically due to buildings or infrastructure not having ramps or proper examination beds, or communicatively due to lack of sign language interpreter or easy to understand material, or also culturally due to harmful stereotypes and attitudes, and also not having the interpretation of these native languages. Healthcare workers often lack understanding about disabilities, and there are even more biasness when it comes to my perspective, like indigenous and also having disability. So we are often seen as people who don't even need SRHR services, as if we desire to or choose autonomy don't exist for us. While I have been going to take the services for my own body care, like having caring for myself, and when there no one talks about menstruation, about consent, or about sexuality, right? There's a deep discomfort around disability and womanhood. So it leads to internalized shame and lack of confidence in speaking about our own needs. So that's how I've been feeling, and yeah, that's my experience about it.
Deepika, like you said, when it comes to healthcare services, especially those around SRHR, and they are not available near your community, can you show us through some examples, like the impact of this lack of access that has on your community, how this inaccessibility shows up in basic services like contraception, safe childbirth support, gynecological care, etc.?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, because this really matters when it comes to indigenous peoples, because mostly indigenous people are the people or community which are mostly close to the nature, and their whole cultural activities and their livelihoods are dependent on nature, and they do worship nature instead of worshipping God. So, our indigenous communities from such geographical region where there are forests and some places where hilly areas or Himalaya areas, there are more indigenous communities who have been protecting our ancestral lands, indigenous lands, since very far. They, in such remote area, indigenous people are found. When it comes to the services related to SRHR or just basic healthcare services or the education, we get limited to that kind of services. So when it comes to SRHR services, in such remote area or hill area, mostly in Nepal, there are three geographical regions that are Himalaya, hilly regions, and the Tarai region, we say the plain areas. So we are in plain areas, though there are Chure range, which is a small range of hill, and most of the indigenous people are there. And those who are Tharo community, uh, one of the community of indigenous people, so they are in the plain area, though they are farmers and they do farming. They also lack access to SRHR because of their own culture and way of living and having life standard, the way of they are having like own cultural things and doing farming. So they basically their language barrier matters there, because most of the indigenous people don't know their native language is their own. Their first language is their native language or the mother tongue. Their first second language is Nepali. So when they try to speak Nepali or communicate in Nepali, their accent or the words get confused by other people while communicating with other people also. Now the person who they talk to, they think that she don't know Nepali, and they discriminate, thinking that she is even Nepali and don't know how to talk Nepali, and her accent is so funny that it is not even considerable. So that feel that it's very funny, and while talking Nepali, they make them feel very guilty that my Nepali is not good. I have to learn Nepali instead of learning own my language and owning my own language. So that's how we feel. And while taking when we go to take the services of SRHR or any healthcare services, those who are there to provide us services, they mostly they don't know Nepali, because when they come from very educated family and non-indigenous people, and they don't know how to talk the local language or the indigenous language, so they think that what is she talking about, they don't know what they are saying. I'm giving an example of a person who is deaf and is also from indigenous community, and a couple is going there to consult about her pregnancy and regular checkups. When it comes to that health post, the service provider don't have SLI there, sign language interpreter, so she cannot communicate her whatever she is suffering from or whatever she is feeling inside or she wanted to check up. She cannot convey that and convey and communicate what she is feeling. So at that time there will be a communication barrier, and at the same time there will be cultural barrier that what is she talking about. She is from indigenous community, and they most of the indigenous communities don't have access to education, they are not educated. So I don't think she is talking more anything about it, so must be talking some very common thing. So are you, if she is showing that my stomach, if she is there to talk about her pregnancy, then she will show her belly or the stomach. So the person who is providing the services, she will think that she is having a stomach ache or must be happening something inside. Until and unless you will not have a person or the member of family who talks, who can communicate Nepali or in even in local language, she cannot communicate or cannot go to take her own SRHR services from health post. Because when it comes to gynecological things or taking our own SRHR services, it comes to like privacy also. So we want us to have some private things that what we don't want to share it to other people. So when it comes to person with disability, they don't have that privacy because people think that she needs someone, she needs to depend upon someone, and she needs someone's assistance. There is no privacy when it comes to HR services in our conditions. Yeah.
Yeah, privacy and agency.
Yeah.
That agency is taken away from disabled people, and it becomes even more complicated when multiple layers of marginalizations come into the picture. But taking it one step further, this we talked about in the context of healthcare services. So, how have you seen people with disabilities, especially indigenous women and girls, are being treated within both the indigenous communities as well as the mainstream community, as in like societal biases that they face at home within community, especially from the point of view of access to health? What are the kinds of attitudes or misconceptions which are harmful or isolating for the people?
In this question, moreover, the poor understanding of disability within the both indigenous and mainstream communities or the health service providers and creates it, which creates harmful attitudes like they think that person with disabilities, they have no desires to sexual activities, they cannot conceive babies, and they don't have to because they cannot take care of it themselves. Then how will she conceive and take further take care of that baby for herself? So she needs assistance by herself, she don't have to take care, or she needs to have contraceptives, or she don't have that ability to conceive and have no choice to make decision for our own body or any, our own desires. So these are the some misconception, and many people still see person individual with disabilities as helpless or dependent, as I said earlier. and they do not see us as deserving for like sexual autonomy or reproductive health care. This stigmatization and discrimination have become even more intense when person is both having a disability, indigenous, and in our society like South Asian countries, women identity of women and the gender very complicates our more like discriminations and barriers. For instance, like in the healthcare system, like in health posts in remote area or even in a city or urban area, doctor may assume that we are not capable of having making decisions about our own bodies, or they may not know how to communicate effectively with us. The intersection of these identities leads to compounded discrimination and neglect, where our voices are rarely heard and our needs are often ignored. So that's how it's been affecting us.
How about counseling services? You mentioned about disabled people, disabled couples. So, what kind of
Yeah.
counseling services are there for disabled couples? Would you have any examples on that?
I see within the communities the lived experience and of people with disabilities, and mostly women with disabilities, that these kind of things are mostly seen as a scene also in cultural way. People think that it's a sin to think about it. And when it comes to navigating about person with disabilities, in our society, person with disabilities are mostly seen with charity based things, which leads us to more marginalization and get very less access to our any services. If you talk about, it's not only about SRH when it comes to our own desires, it also like fundamental basic services that we have as a person with disability. For person with disability, accessibility is the fundamental things that need to be, and CRPD says that a person with disability must have the access to education within their own community. They shouldn't go, or they don't have to go far away in another city to learn such basic education. So we don't have that, and it's obvious them for that service provider not to know about it, because the first thing is that person with disability don't have that awareness that I can learn and I can communicate with the help of HLI. So that's the first thing. And when it comes to indigenous rights, we say that because of this kind of lack of awareness and limited access to education, those deaf indigenous with disability cannot even learn their own language, which is very basic thing. So these are the barriers they face, and it's pretty obvious that the service provider don't know, because government never consider within the education system or the examination of public services. They don't have these kind of like questions. They have lots of GK question, technological question, medical question, but they don't consider this kind of very basic question, because they will be solving it in local area, and they don't consider these kind of things which should be very basic.
It's if you have to be accepted, or if you want to engage, you have to know a certain language, you have to belong to a certain class, you have to belong to a certain demographic in order to be
Yeah,
seen and heard and
yeah,
be validated as a human being who has emotions, who is going through pain. And like health service providers is a different thing. You face this first in your own communities, in your own family, and more so if you are disabled, indigenous, and a woman,
yeah,
or like a girl. Like you mentioned briefly about how the indigenous community is deeply intertwined with nature, and
yeah,
climate change, like this summer is excruciating, and knowing that climate change is affecting our lives now more so than ever. Climate change is often talked about without considering its impact on people with disabilities. So what do
yeah.
you think is missing in these conversations, especially when it comes to indigenous and marginalized women and girls with disabilities?
Okay, I will be giving an example, like lived example of climate change impacts on indigenous women and girls with disabilities. And in COVID, we can give example of COVID and take example of earthquake in Nepal, the biggest earthquake and the impact of COVID in Nepal, that indigenous women and girls with disabilities faced very challenging and periods while accessing the basic fundamental things that government was providing in such a pandemic. So when it was earthquake in Nepal, that time women in Kathmandu, the most affected area was Kathmandu and Nepal Chowk and other places of hill area. So at that time, Kathmandu is the capital city of Nepal. So at that time, there was so many chaos happening all around. The earthquake is happening time and again with some levels. Indigenous women with disabilities, they did not have accessible formats or any kind of infrastructure they were having in Khulla Chor. So in that kind of environment, in such environment, there was the high risk of having assaulted by people or male, and also that there was no early warning system or accessible information for person with disabilities. In according to disability perspective, there was no an accessible information technology, or they had no access to information what is happening all around, like what government is providing services at that kind of chaos, and they had to leave their home or whatever they were in, apartment or any kind of room they were staying in, and they had to leave that and stay in a khula chol in a very chaotic way. So at that time they had no accessible access to information, that what is happening all around my environment, what is the condition of this earthquake, is it going to happen again or not, should I go then to my room or not, should I stay here for how many days. They did not know, they couldn't even figure out that what is happening. So those who were studying there for a purpose of higher education, most of person with disabilities are in Kathmandu for educational purpose, that they don't have higher studies in their own community or local level area. So those mostly blind people and indigenous people from hilly areas and Himalaya areas, they were there taking a room and staying in a PG or room, and staying there for by themselves or in a hostel. So mostly blind women have the access to like hostel, so they did not know where to go, and they couldn't even just run from their own hostel who is in second floor, and with that earthquake of 7.6 Richter, she couldn't figure out that where should I run, and who will be able to just rescue me there after that earthquake. There was no any rescuer, they were only finding person, those who are the rescuer or the government was only sending the rescue to to those areas that was mostly harmed, and people could see that yeah, it is the building has been devastated, and the person who was already in there, they couldn't figure out that there could be a person with disability, and those who were person with disabilities rights are advocating for themselves, and they came together and told you should be focusing first with taking priorities with rescuing person with disabilities, and taking the mind being mindful of prioritizing person with disabilities. And the government also don't give any awareness about the disaster prone area or like this kind of things, those who will highly impacted area of like their own due to their own geographical reason. Government should be the responsible to make people aware of it. They must know and recognize and identify the vulnerable areas, vulnerable community, vulnerable groups, and should plan about the climate impacts and how they will be navigating about it, how will be the response of person with disabilities in such chaos time. So they our government lacks that kind of planning and to these kind of things or to face about it in climate impacts. We have policies in federal level, not in local level. When it comes to climate change, climate action or climate issues, we say that there must be a plan and policies regarding communities, not regarding federal level or policy level or any kind of provincial level. There should be only community level or local level. So when it comes to only federal level or provincial level, the communities issues are often prioritized and left behind those vulnerable groups, because there are lots of issues and lots to be integrated, but when it comes to climate change impacts, there are only discussion in national level, not even in provincial level often. So as a indigenous people with disabilities, we don't even come under the mostly left behind within the mainstream agendas or mainstream movements of climate action or women action or women movement, disability movement, or within the indigenous movement, because we consider indigenous movement as our own movement because we belong to indigenous community rather than disability or women. So these kind of movements also don't consider ourselves and representation of ours. So yeah, we are left behind in this kind of issues.
Dipika, what about SRHR issues when it comes to climate change, disability, and being from the indigenous community? How does that look like? How do these issues intersect?
Again, this deeply overlooked issue like climate change discussion often remains centered on environmental, economical, or technological solutions, but they rarely consider the social and human rights dimensions, like especially for people at the margins, like indigenous women and girls with disabilities, person with disabilities, women, and other marginalized, social marginalized communities. These are the groups which are mostly affected by climate change. And there is a statement called, whenever when we start discussing and navigating about this climate change, they say that, why do you talk and keep saying that indigenous people or local people or vulnerable people only face only face climate change impacts? They claim that this is wrong statement. Climate change is the issue of global issues, so it every person is affected equally, they say that, but it's not true. We vulnerable groups are the one who is affected disproportionately, so they have to accept it, which they don't want to, because they think that if we accept it globally, the whole funds or whatever we are asking about climate finance justice, that will be located to those vulnerable groups only, because the whole thing is like those whole funds needs to go to community directly, not through any other people. So they don't want, they deliberately don't want to acknowledge it. So what's missing is an intersectional perspective, like climate related disasters such as floods, droughts, or like landslides and glacier lake outburst and heat waves, the melting of snow, as we are in Nepal, the Mount Everest is melting, and it is disproportionately affecting indigenous people and also other lots of people from Nepal. That don't affect all people equally, because indigenous women and girls with disabilities experience a compounded impact because of their location. Like as I said, the indigenous people are nature lover, worshipper of nature, rather than worshipping God. Because of the location where they are found, mostly in the natural resources, like in river areas, bank of rivers, and the hilly area, and the forest near area. So they think that these are the given by nature, so we must always connect with nature, and nature are the one who are giver for any kind of human needs. So the real lack of access to resources and the systematic inequalities, they already face this kind of compounding impacts. So it impacts a lot of things, like additionally during climate induced disasters, essential healthcare services like including SRHR become even more inaccessible in that kind of condition and chaos. For women with disabilities, in this might mean being unable to reach a health facility, facing communication barriers if sign language interpreters or native language interpreters are not available, or encountering healthcare staff who are not trained to assist person with disabilities patients respectfully and effectively. They do face, and they feel like, I shouldn't have come here, I shouldn't have exposed myself. There's nothing like exposing yourself. They make them feel like you are exposing yourself and you are not like worth of saying it and taking it. So there is a lack of data and disaggregated research on climate change effects, like for in the lens or perspective of person with disabilities and indigenous lens, which means policies often overlook them, right? So they are not just vulnerable, they are invisible in climate dialogues, like adaptation planning and resilience building programs. Yeah, so we also need to talk about livelihood loss, because many indigenous families rely on agriculture or the natural resources. As I already said, they are the nature worshipper. So they have been protecting the whole natural resources before they are here. When climate change impacts those kind of systems, indigenous women and disabilities are often the first to suffer economically and the last to receive the support due to layers of exclusion. from land rights to financial and distribution things, like whenever they come here to distribute the relief from the government, we are the most least person or the least to receive those kind of reliefs. Those who have already power and connections with the local government or the government, that who have power, they get it easily. And those who are marginalized and like from social marginalized identities like indigenous, Madesi people, Muslim people especially, and women's, so is they are the first one to suffer these kind of things. Moreover, traditional coping mechanisms and community support systems are weakening due to migration, with internal migration and climate stress. Like for someone already facing cultural discrimination or gender based violence, these only increase their vulnerability. So a real climate approach must center the voices of those who are most at risk, not as victims, but as experts of their own lived realities. Like indigenous women and girls with disabilities hold rich local knowledge, resilience strategies, and leadership potential, but unless they are meaningfully included in decision making at local, national, or global levels. So we will continue to see policy solution that feel the most marginalized. That's why I always emphasize that we need to integrate disability rights, indigenous rights, and gender justice into climate action frameworks. So inclusion is not optional, according to me. Inclusion is not optional; it's a necessity for building a just and sustainable future. Yeah.
Actually, after our initial conversation, when I was discussing how to go about capturing all these experiences, I remembered you had mentioned how a lot of disabled people also have shared that they get rashes because of the assistive devices during climate change, like very small instances, everyday life experiences that nobody talks about and it gets invisibilized. Similarly, like you shared, during climate disasters, wash facilities are not there, sanitation facilities are not there, and it's challenging for an able bodied person and with disability and other marginalizations like belonging to the indigenous community, that ends up creating even more layers of marginalization which needs our attention. And recently I was talking to someone and we were talking about like relief packages that the government, the state government, or the governments provide during these disasters, and how SRHR services or sanitation facilities are overlooked. Like in the relief packages, things like pads, those are not included always. This becomes an afterthought that is not considered one of the essential items. And you know how that creates more challenges for women. Would you have any such examples from your community in these natural disasters?
Yes, we have that experience. And when there was a disaster and flood occurring in our province, we provided relief from our own internal fund. We provided dignity kit related to health and services for that purpose, medical kit. So we call it not medical kit but a dignity kit. So it was the concept was from new UN women. So we followed it and we started saying that while we are awareness to that local government, saying that when you will be providing such kind of relief, you need to provide such kind of dignity kit or any kind of essential things that are related to women, because in this kind of chaos or like disaster, we women have no other place to find such kind of sanitary pads or like any medical tablets or any kind of medical services. At that time we need such rather than providing other things or any kind of like torch lights. So for this is the most essential thing as much as you think for other people. So you need to be considerable that women needs pads, because every month women go with like menstruation, and some women with disabilities needs assistance when even though they have that menstruation. And when those people with spinal cord injury, women with disability, they need special kind of services like needs of like urinary bag each and every time they wanted to do that urine or wanted to pee, then that's the most essential thing rather than eating or drinking for that person. So you need to consider what is necessary for what kind of person and what kind of community. So please be considerable and considerate that things. So we redistribute relief with some foods and nutritious things, and as well as the dignity kit. And when we went to talk with women with disability, they said that the because of that flood, the water level was up to belly button. So it was very chaos for us, and thank God, she was saying that thank God I was with my family. Sometimes my families goes outside because they are farmers and they have to go and do whole day work and in field, so that they can grow and sell that crops and make it as a livelihood. So they have to go every day, or sometime that could be someone with me to assist me, and sometimes there are no people. At that time I was with my family, so I thank God for that kind of situation, making my family with me. So I was very disappointed and I was feeling very miserable by myself, thinking that what if she was not with us, with her family, and who will be responsible for it if she was taken away by flood. So at that time, so the government and the local people and those who are in the decision making place, they need to understand this kind of intersectional perspective, as well as it's a human rights thing. It's not just a basic needs or just a thing that we are desiring. It's not a desire. It's a basic human needs of person with disabilities. So that's what we say while advocating, that it's our rights, not we are asking you because we are desiring or we are having luxurious desire. According to the concept of ableism, people assume that we are not capable, we don't have the same needs or desire as others. So in healthcare or education setting, for example, staff don't even consider that we might need other services, or we might want to lead or study or work. They're just the deep rooted stigma that we are often treated like we don't matter. Yeah, that's what we are facing.
You very rightly pointed out the importance of taking an intersectional approach. And unfortunately, movements, whether feminist, disability, or indigenous, don't always include everyone that they claim to represent, right? So,
Yes.
what has invisibilization within these spaces looked like for you, impacted you, and what real inclusion and leadership by indigenous women and girls with disabilities looks like for you, according to your perspective?
Yeah, this is a very important and often uncomfortable truth to address. As an indigenous women with disability and advocating for our own identity within our own mainstream indigenous movement, they don't recognize us as a person with disability or indigenous person with disability. They don't acknowledge us, thinking that they have their own different compounding issues as they with their common issues. So as an indigenous women with disability, we have experienced what it means to be invisibilized, even within the very movements that are supposed to fight for inclusion and justice. So, for example, in the mainstream disability movement, most conversations revolved around physical accessibility or legal rights, but very rarely do they talk about how disability is experienced differently by marginalized communities or social marginalized identities or minority groups or indigenous peoples, because they have their own traditions, cultural activities, and own way of living, and or how gender, caste, ethnicity, or geographical shape or our access to those rights. So I have been, or we have been in national disability forums like NFDN or on other umbrella organizations where there are no interpreter for like indigenous languages, native languages, and no space to talk about issues that especially affect women or indigenous communities. It often feels unless you fit the urban male or dominated like caste profile of disability leadership, your voice is not heard. Similarly, in the women's right or feminist movement, disability is still largely an afterthought. Policies and programs are often designed with able-bodied women in minded. For example, SRHR campaigns for frequently forget to include accessibility in clinics, educational material in accessible formats, or like information for women with intellectual or sensory disabilities. And for indigenous women with disabilities, they don't even think that their first language couldn't be that English or Nepali, because we have our own native language and we don't formally understand Nepali. If even you, I, according to my experience, whenever I talk Nepali, I mostly forgot the formal words of Nepali. So I can't say that, and people say that, why don't you know how to talk Nepali, you're Nepal. Because of this kind of lacking, your voices are often unheard and mostly not prioritized because of this, because the words really matters. Like while advocating the powerful words in Nepali, I don't know that because this is not my first language, and how will I know the powerful words of Nepali or any other language which is not my first language? And because of this, advocating for even those who are advocating for 20 years or 16 years back, they have been advocating for it, and indigenous movement is still behind than a women movement. That's why, because their own language or the way of they are advocating, the powerful words are not mostly addressed, and the way of thinking to indigenous people don't know how to talk. They don't know how to address people formally, because when you talk officially, they need formal words to address themselves. Like, why didn't you say me Mr. in Nepali? Why didn't you say me Miss, Ma'am? Or like, why didn't you say me you went there in formal way? That was the direct way to say it. You don't know how to talk, you don't have some kind of manners, they say that way. So we often feel humiliated and feel like we are made fun of, like our own accent or the way we talk. So we are backward because of that also. And I have heard people say that we will start focus on indigenous right, then we will talk about disability later. But for someone like me, those identities are not separate, they coexist for us. And so delaying disability inclusion means like I'm still being left behind even in a space that's supposed to represent me. So this kind of individualization is deeply painful for us, those who have multiple identities. And because it only denies us accessing and representing, but it also sends a message that our experiences don't matter to person who are in decision making place, even among our own communities. And yet we are here, we have knowledge, we have leadership, and we are organizing everything. Real inclusion for me means like recognizing and resourcing indigenous women and girls with disabilities and marginalized communities as decision makers, not just a participants as a tokenism in a tokenism system. So it means like creating spaces that are physically, linguistically, and like culturally accessible. It means asking us what we need and co-creating solution with us, not for us. People say that, oh, first we will solve about indigenous, then we will solve about disability, then we'll solve about gender. That doesn't apply for us, because that kind of an identity really coexists for us. Real inclusion for us means recognizing and resourcing indigenous women with disabilities as decision makers, not just as participants, or not just as a partaking and representing us in a tokenism way. It means like creating spaces that are physically, linguistically, and culturally accessible for us, which needs to happen. And it means asking us what we need and co-creating solution with us, not for us. It means challenging leadership structures that have historically excluded us and being intentionally about whose voices are at the center of advocacy. Inclusion is not just about inviting us to the table, it's about building the table with us from the beginning, so that we all of our identities are honored and all of our needs are integrated from the start. not from after we will finish this and we will start again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dipika. Dipika has done some amazing work and has advocated, like she mentioned, in the national and even in the global. And we will be including the UNHRC statement that spoke at, and then also the Beijing Plus 30 review statement. We will be hyperlinking that in the description box, so do check that out. But yeah, Dipika, this was such humbling experience, and I'm not exaggerating it, because when you study within a certain colonial educational system, you also tend to idealize some of those tools, like we say the master's tools, right?
Yeah.
And you start to idealize some of them. But the work that movement builders, grassroots organizers are doing is actually the work that is commendable, and that needs more spotlight, that needs more funding, that needs more attention. And like you said, not just a place at the table, that table has to be reconstructed, keeping
Yeah.
in mind the dignity, the rights of everyone involved, and nobody should be making decisions for marginalized people. There are no voiceless people. People are deliberately not listening to certain voices, which needs attention. So thank you for bringing that out in this very important conversation. Any parting thoughts you have?
Thank you so much, sister, for creating this kind of space and for holding such meaningful conversations. Like, I just want to say to everyone listening us, our voices matters. Indigenous women and girls with disabilities have so much wisdom, strength, and lived experience to offer. We are not just survivors of discrimination. We are leaders, healers, and change makers. As we close, I also want to emphasize that sexual and reproductive health and rights, SRH, are basic human rights, not the privileges or special needs. For us, for many of us, like just accessing something as fundamental as contraceptions, menstruation support, or safe childbirth care is still a struggle for us. And this is not just about services, it's about autonomy, dignity, and bodily integrity. So we deserve to have access to information and healthcare without barriers, in our languages, in our formats we understand, and in environment that respects us. So our needs should not be overlooked, and our rights should never be negotiable.